The Dreamcast had arguably one of the most successful launches in console gaming history, with 9/9/99 marking its debut in North America, with as many as 300,000 units moving in a single day. However, the Dreamcast had a ticking clock looming over its victory. Despite Sega releasing the Dreamcast with considerable success, the company was facing an uphill battle. They had stumbled under the financial burden of the Saturn in the prior gaming generation, with it failing to gain the user base necessary to make it profitable. And the Saturn had drained much of the war chest Sega had fought for under the Genesis in the early 90s, and that war chest was getting lighter. Sega put up a valiant fight with the Dreamcast, having an initial surge in sales that looked very promising, but more factors worked against the system than were working in its favor. Production issues leading to supply problems, and ultimately the pending release of the PlayStation 2, worked in tandem to hinder the system's continued success. In March of 2001, Sega ended the dream and walked away from being a console manufacturer. The company had gambled on the Dreamcast hoping it would improve their situation, but sadly it only cemented their demise. The financial burden of waging a console war had practically bankrupted the company, and Sega was on the verge of dissolving into gaming history, if not for the actions of the late Isao Okawa, who had loaned Sega $500 million in 1999 to pursue the Dreamcast. But when events turned against Sega, Isao Okawa stepped up yet again to help the company he had been a part of since 1984. He forgave Sega's debt to him and returned $695 million worth of Sega stock, giving Sega enough wind to navigate the transition to a third-party publisher. Sadly, Isao Okawa passed away shortly after on March 16, 2001. Before Sega had reached this critical point in its history, it could have been saved from its slow and fortunate demise and retooled for another purpose. Before Microsoft had released the Xbox, there was a serious collaboration going on between them and Sega, with Microsoft paying Sega to port some of their titles to Windows, and Sega being very happy to do so for the handsome fee, which had helped prop up the company during the financially lean years of the Saturn. The two companies have worked rather well together, leading to Sega approaching Microsoft for work on the Dreamcast, with Windows CE as a result. This strong working relationship brought about discussion of a potential merger. There are two stories about the potential merger of Sega and Microsoft. The first story comes from the book Service Games, The Rise and Fall of Sega, which tells the story as one of an initial promising start, with the two companies coming together with mutual respect because of their past work experience. But according to the Sam Pettis recount of events, the merger fell apart on two key issues. The first was that Sega wanted the Xbox to be reverse compatible with the Dreamcast. The other issue was working with the bloated development environment of Windows, which Sega favored their own APIs over what Microsoft had to offer. So in the Service Games account, Sega walked away on those issues. The second story about the potential merger of Sega and Microsoft comes from a 2013 IGN article, where an interview with Joachim Kempen, a former high-ranking executive at Microsoft, stated that Microsoft was interested in buying Sega because of the brand and the development houses the company could offer. The thought process behind that would be Sega was an established brand in the industry, and it would save Microsoft the hassle of having to come up with their own name and brand recognition that people can trust as consumers. Ultimately, the deal was called off by Bill Gates himself.
But for Bill Gates, this wasn't enough. He didn't think that Sega had enough muscle to eventually stop Sony, so we did our own Xbox thing. There were some talks, but it never materialized because Sega was a very different bird. It was always Sony and Nintendo, right? And Nintendo had some financial trouble at that point in time. So Sony came out with the PlayStation, and bang, they took off, and everyone else was left behind.
In this account, the events all came down to Bill Gates and his personal feelings about the situation, which ultimately Bill Gates would have huge control over the event. Microsoft's work on the Dreamcast proved to be somewhat of a testing ground for the early Xbox concepts, a fact that Sega wasn't too happy about. But Sega swallowed their pride because of how it could sour a possible development platform for Sega in the future, which at this point the Dreamcast was looking more and more like a losing contender for Sega. The possible merger of the two companies was revisited several times in the media of the era, with companies speculating that Sega was making games for the Xbox in exchange for reverse compatibility. Those rumors were subsequently squashed, with Isao Okawa stating that Microsoft would play no role in Sega's Dreamcast plans. Isao Okawa did confirm that Microsoft did ask Sega for assistance in the development of the Xbox, but the deal fell through because of mutual disagreements. The deal that could have saved Sega as a home console company fell through. The nature of the merger would have fundamentally changed Sega into something else, an extension of Microsoft, which would have kept Sega in operation, but would have become something entirely different than the company that had brought the world innovative systems like the Genesis. Sega, as odd as it sounds, pridefully stood with the Dreamcast to the bitter end, supporting the system until the company could no longer sustain it. For many, the Dreamcast was the grand swan song of the Sega home console business. It brought about innovative changes that would be reflected in later console generations, like incorporated modems and/or LAN support, and the console's legacy will always be remembered fondly by those who enjoyed the system. Hey, thank you for watching the Historicnerd today. If you like this content, feel free to go check out my website, or I highly suggest you go and check out Yahel from Wrestles with Gaming. His channel has fantastic retro-related content as well. But if you have any other interest in other similar Sega-like content, please check out my other videos. But thank you for watching Historicnerd today. Hope you have a wonderful day, evening, night, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.